Hello there, everybody. Hola, and welcome to the Spanish GCSE and iGCSE video tutorial. So, in this particular tutorial, we are looking at definitely a harder element of Spanish GCSE and iGCSE grammar, which is the imperfect tense and the preterite tense. So, I'm going to take you through the differences between these tenses, how and when to use each one, and then how to form them. So, it should be really good. First of all, I'm Dhananjay Talwar. I studied French and Italian for my MA degree at the University of Cambridge, graduating back in 2015, and I've been an educator, mainly a full time tutor actually, since then. I've learned more than 20 languages to different levels myself, including at least 9 to fluency, one of which is, of course, Spanish. And yeah, it's something that I find very rewarding, something I love to do, and probably will always be a passion and hobby of mine. Likewise, motivating my students is something I really enjoy doing, and giving them the tools to be able to learn languages effectively while also having a huge amount of fun. And I have helped over 500 students thus far to achieve or even exceed their target grade for GCSE or iGCSE language exams while a full time tutor. I've taught about 8 languages so far to GCSE or iGCSE level, and several of those at high levels as well. So now these are the Spanish GCSE and iGCSE exam boards. So as of August 2025, there are 4 exam boards out there for GCSE Spanish and 2 for iGCSE Spanish. You do need to be aware of which exam board you're taking, ideally as early as possible, because there are some small differences from exam board to exam board. This video, however, is on a part of Spanish GCSE and iGCSE grammar, or Spanish language grammar, which is that of 2 of the most common past tenses, the imperfect and preterite tenses. So this should be relevant for absolutely all students. So the imperfect tense and the preterite tense then. These are both past tenses, and together they are the 2 most common past tenses that you'll come across in Spanish. They're both what I would refer to as core tenses for Spanish GCSE or iGCSE. In other words, along with perhaps the future, present, and maybe the conditional as well. Those are the most important tenses that you as a student need to be aware of for Spanish GCSE and iGCSE, and you should focus on memorizing those tenses first of all, I'd say, including the irregular forms. And we will come across and see irregular forms for both of these tenses, the imperfect and preterite, later in this video. So knowing when to use them and also how to form each of them is an important part of Spanish GCSE and iGCSE. These are definitely common tenses that come up in Spanish, and you will come across them at GCSE and iGCSE level. The main thing students struggle with, typically, from my experience, is differentiating between the tenses. So knowing when to use the imperfect tense and when to use the preterite tense. And that is what we'll cover first, before going on to how to form each of these tenses. Many students might know or understand how to form the tenses, although there can be plenty of irregular forms too. But they won't necessarily be sure of how to how to use these tenses in practice and what the difference is between them. So that is the first thing that we're looking at here, how to use each of these tenses, the imperfect and the preterite. So the imperfect tense is used for continuous or repeated actions in the past. It can also be used for background information, as long as it's something that was constantly the same or constantly the case for some time. But really, the difference between the imperfect and the preterite tense comes down to this idea of regularity. So it's not about how far back in the past the action occurred. Both tenses could be used to describe something that happened really recently, for example. The key difference is the idea of regularity. So the imperfect tense is used when you're talking about continuous or repeated regular actions in the past. And there is an example here. When I was little, I used to play football every day, which in Spanish would be cuando era pequeño, or pequeña for a girl, jugaba al fútbol cada día. And I've put in bold here the time phrase every day, or cada día in Spanish, or todos los días if you prefer as well, because that shows us that indicates more clearly that you'd have to use the imperfect tense here. And of course, in this example, both of the verbs, era and jugaba, those are both in the imperfect tense. The reason why you use the imperfect tense is because clearly, if you played football every day in the past, then it is pretty much by definition a regular or repeated action in the past. And that time phrase every day makes it much clearer that we're talking about something that occurred regularly or was repeated in the past, and so we must use the imperfect tense. The preterite tense, on the other hand, is for one-off actions in the past. Normally, these actions would have taken place at a very specific point in time. That is the crucial difference between the imperfect and the preterite tense, which is likely to take some practice, and many students can struggle with that idea of regularity in the past. For instance, if you were to say, yesterday I played football with my friends, in Spanish, this would be ayer jugué al fútbol con mis amigos. And that verb jugué is, of course, in the preterite tense. Ayer or yesterday could indicate the preterite tense should be used instead of the imperfect tense, but it is possible, certainly, to come up with sentences using the imperfect tense, even when you're talking about something that happened yesterday. The key thing really is this idea of regularity. So this sentence does not imply in any way at all that the person, the subject of the sentence, the person doing the action, played football more than once. It comes across as a one-off action in the past. It happened also at a specific point in time, and that's why the preterite tense is used and not the imperfect tense. Many people can find this a bit confusing. For example, if you were to say, yesterday I went to school, that verb I went should be in the preterite tense in Spanish. Many people will find it confusing because they would think, I go to school every day. I have been going to school for a long time. So surely that should go in the imperfect tense instead. So that logic makes some sense. However, within that sentence, yesterday I went to school or yesterday I played football with my friends, that particular sentence does not imply or indicate in any way that the action happened more than once. That sentence makes it come across as a one-off action in the past. And that's why you would use the preterite tense. So even if you did, in fact, go to school every day for the last 4 or 5 days at least, you would still use the preterite tense to say, yesterday I went to school, for example. Okay, now we're going to go on to how to form each of these tenses. So we're going to start with the imperfect tense, or el imperfecto, as it's called in Spanish. And to translate this tense into English, the imperfect tense would generally translate as I was something-ing, or I used to something. For example, I was doing, or I used to do. There are two most common translations or ways of translating the imperfect tense into English. Generally, one of those two is how you should translate it in English. To actually form the imperfect tense, again, we're going to have two parts of it, like you do for most tenses in Spanish. You'd have a stem, which is the first part of the word, and that will be followed by a certain set of endings, which are added on just to the end of the stem. To create the stem for the imperfect tense in Spanish, you simply start with the infinitive of the verb, which would end in AR, ER, or IR in Spanish, and you take off the last two letters. So if it's an AR verb, you remove the AR. For ER verbs, you remove the ER. And for IR verbs, you get rid of the IR. And then you're going to add the correct imperfect tense ending. And I will show you these on the next slide. These are the endings. So there's two sets of endings, as you can see, for the imperfect tense verbs. The first set on the left-hand side is the set of endings for AR verbs only. So for verbs whose infinitives end in AR. And those endings are aba, abas, aba, abamos, abais, aban. For example, the verb hablar, meaning to speak, commonly used as an example verb in Spanish, we'd create the stem by taking the infinitive hablar, removing that ending to the infinitive, which is AR, and that gives us habl as the stem. Then you just have to add the appropriate ending for the imperfect tense. So if you want to create the yo form of the imperfect tense, that would become hablaba or yo hablaba if you want to emphasize the person doing the action. which would translate into English as I was speaking or I used to speak. So those are the endings for AR verbs on the left-hand side. You can see that on the right-hand side, we have a different set of endings for ER and IR verbs. And both ER and IR verbs have the same set of endings as each other. But they are crucially different to the endings used for AR verbs. So the endings in the imperfect tense for ER and IR verbs are ia, ias, ia, iamos, iais, and ian. Of course, those are for each of the different persons of the verb. And do note the accent as well on the I. There is an accent on habamos, the nosotros form for AR verbs, but that's the only one. There are far more accents in the endings for ER and IR verbs. So, a couple of examples. If we look at the verb comer, meaning to eat, to form the stem, we take the infinitive comer, remove the ER ending, and that gives us com, which is the stem for the imperfect tense. And then we would just add the appropriate ending for the imperfect tense. So if we want to form the yo form, that would be yo comía, taking the first of these endings. Comía or yo comía, which would translate as I was eating or I used to eat. And it works extremely similarly for IR verbs like vivir, meaning to live. You take the infinitive and remove the IR ending of the infinitive to get the stem, which is viv, V-I-V. And then you would add the correct ending of the imperfect tense. For the yo form, for instance, that would be the first one here, which is ia. So the yo form in the imperfect tense would become vivia or yo vivia, meaning I was living or I used to live. So this is just to illustrate the imperfect tense for the three different kinds of regular verbs in Spanish. AR verbs like hablar on the left-hand side, ER verbs like comer in the middle, and IR verbs like vivir on the right-hand side. So do make a note of this, especially areas that are new or that you're less confident with. Okay, there are also some irregular verbs that you need to know for the imperfect tense in Spanish. So what we've just seen up till now is how to form the imperfect for regular verbs. In other words, verbs that do follow the normal or the standard pattern in Spanish. There are, however, a few irregular verbs, so verbs that do not follow that normal pattern at all, and verbs that just need to be memorized to some extent in the imperfect tense. The good thing is, though, that there are only a few of these in Spanish in the imperfect tense. There's only a few irregular verbs, and those are very, very common ones. So ser, one of the verbs meaning to be, ir, to go, and ver, to see. So for the verb ser, the imperfect tense, the stem is quite different. It becomes and yeah, the imperfect tense of ser would be era, eras, era, éramos, erais, eran. For the verb ir, meaning to go, it becomes iba, ibas, iba, íbamos, ibais, iban. And for the verb ver, to see, I suppose this is technically a tiny bit irregular still, it becomes veía, veías, veía, veíamos, veíais, veían. So make a note of those. Make sure that you're aware of irregular forms, which are likely to take longer to memorize too. But luckily, there are only a few of them in the imperfect tense. Okay, now we're going to move on to the preterite tense, or el pretérito as it's called in Spanish, and how to form that. So the preterite tense would translate into English as I somethinged. In English, that form would usually end in ed, but not always. For example, I did, I saw, I went, and so on. And to form the preterite tense, the stem is actually the same as for the imperfect tense. So to form the stem, which is the first part of the word, you'd begin with the infinitive and take away the last two letters of that infinitive, which would be the ending, either AR, ER, or IR ending. So, for instance, for the verb hablar, meaning to speak, you'd start with the infinitive hablar, you'd remove the AR ending, and that gives you habl, which is the stem. And you will then add the appropriate preterite tense ending onto the end of that stem. And I will show you these endings on the next slide. So here we go. These are the sets of endings for verbs in the preterite tense in Spanish. Again, you've got two sets of endings, as you can see, and they're split up exactly the same way as they were for the imperfect tense. So on the left, we have the endings, the set of endings for AR verbs only. And those are e aste o, amos astes aron. And on the right, we have the set of endings for ER and IR verbs. So both ER and IR verbs, again, have the same set of endings as each other, but those are importantly different from the endings used in the preterite tense for AR verbs. And those endings for ER and IR verbs in the preterite are I iste io, imos istes ieron. So it's important, of course, to know both sets of endings. Do note as well that the accents on the first person singular and third person singular forms in the preterite tense for both sets of endings. Okay, so this is a look at the conjugation of regular verbs in the preterite tense, just to give you a good idea of it. So on the left-hand side, we have a typical AR verb like hablar, meaning to speak. In the middle, an ER verb like comer, to eat. And on the right, a typical IR verb like vivir, to live. So this is just giving you an indication of how you'd piece it all together. Hablé would typically translate as I spoke, comí, I ate, viví, I lived, and so on. So you can see that we've applied those endings in the last slide to the stem. Okay. Now let's move on to irregular verbs in the preterite tense. The unfortunate thing is that there are quite a few of these in Spanish. There are plenty of irregulars in the preterite tense. I think the preterite tense and perhaps the present tense have the largest number of irregular forms in Spanish. And that means that this will take longer to learn because irregular forms just have to be memorized to a large extent. The good thing is that the endings themselves largely remain the same. And it's generally the stem that changes. If there is a verb that is irregular in the preterite tense, it's usually the stem that tends to be irregular, largely. So you can look through these examples. I'll give you a bit of time to digest all of this. That's quite a lot of information here. These are the most common irregular verbs in the preterite tense, which do tend to be the most common verbs in the language in general, anyways. And there's a few more on the next slide as well. But I'll give you a bit of time to look over all these. Notice that ser and ir both actually have the same conjugation as each other in the preterite tense. So fui could translate as both I was from the verb ser and I went from the verb ir. So the context should make it clear which one, what the meaning is, in a particular instance. There are some patterns here as well. Estar and tener have very similar preterite tenses, for example, or irregular preterite tense stems. Those mini patterns can make it somewhat easier to memorize, but it is going to take a little bit of extra time to commit all of these irregular forms to memory. Hacer, for example, it's definitely worth noting that the third person singular has a Z instead of C. So the same sound, hizo, but it's written with Z instead of the letter C. Okay, and now I'll show you a few more, as promised on the next slide. So a few more irregular preterite tense verbs. Again, these are the most common ones, so the most essential ones that you should know and revise for GCSE. So on this slide, we have saber, dar, ver, and traer. There are, of course, other irregulars in the preterite tense too, but luckily, this is quite a good list for the ones that you need to know for GCSE and iGCSE. So I would try and revise these and get to the point where you're as confident with understanding and using these as possible. Okay, now I'm going to give you the opportunity, the honor of testing yourself and your understanding of the imperfect tense versus the preterite tense. So here are a few questions on that. So your task is to translate this from English to Spanish. The English sentence is, I saw my friends 2 days ago. So the first thing I would think through is, what is the verb? The verb is I saw. What tense should that go in? It's going to be either the imperfect or the preterite tense. Which of those would be suitable here? And then conjugate that verb and then, translate the rest of the sentence as well. That's the way I would go about it. Okay, let me show you the answer then. So in Spanish or Español, this would be vi a mis amigos or a mis amigas hace 2 días. So the important thing, the most important thing to note here is that the verb be is in the preterite tense. The reason why is because that sentence, I saw my friends 2 days ago, does not indicate that you'd see these friends again in any way. It doesn't indicate a regular or repeated action in the past at all. It certainly indicates a one-off action in the past. And therefore you'd use the preterite tense, which is vi, I saw. Question number 2. The English sentence is, we used to go to the cinema often. So I'll give you a bit of time to think over how to put that into Spanish. Again, the main thing to look at is the verb. We used to go. Would you use the imperfect tense for that in Spanish or the preterite tense? And then put it in the correct form and then translate the rest of the sentence. Okay, I'm going to show the answer. So the Spanish for this would be íbamos al cine a menudo. The important thing here, the most important thing here is that the verb íbamos is in the imperfect tense. Because if you used to do something regularly in the past, you would put it in the imperfect rather than the preterite. And yeah, used to generally is the translation of the imperfect tense in English rather than the preterite tense. There are other ways of potentially translating these sentences if you want as well, but these are certainly the most common. Okay, question number 3 then. A slightly longer one. The English is, I was doing my homework when my mum came in. So we've got 2 verbs here, I was doing and my mum came in. So you need to look at both of those and decide for each which tense it should go in, whether it's the imperfect or preterite. Then translate each of those, put them in the right form, and translate the rest of the sentence as well. Okay, a bit more time for this because it is a harder one or a longer one for sure. Okay, hopefully you're able to write down an answer, and I'm going to show the answer for this now. So the correct answer in Spanish, you would say hacía, or you could say estaba haciendo using a continuous or progressive tense instead, which actually sounds even more Spanish. That's formed from the imperfect tense of estar, followed by the gerund form. Hacía o estaba haciendo mis deberes cuando mi mamá entró. So the important thing is that the first verb goes in the imperfect tense or the imperfect progressive tense, if you prefer, because it's a continuous action. The person was doing their homework over a considerable period of time. It's a more ongoing or regular thing. The second verb, on the other hand, has to go in the preterite tense, which for the verb entrar would become entró in the third person singular. And that's in the preterite tense because my mum came in. Your mum would have come in at a very specific point in time. So that is not a regular or repeated action in the past at all, but a one-off that happened at a very specific point in time. Okay, this is likely to require some practice as it is a tricky aspect of Spanish grammar. That's why I'm doing this video on it. And here are a few quick quiz questions to test how well you understood the imperfect and preterite tenses. Question 1 is, which tense has more irregular verbs? Was it the imperfect tense or the preterite tense? Something that I did mention briefly, but I'm going to give you some time to think about it before I show the answer. Okay, and here is the answer. It's the preterite tense. The preterite tense has more verbs with irregular forms, as we saw in the last few slides, and those do, of course, typically take longer to memorize. So make sure you're aware of that and that you're likely to need more time to revise the preterite tense than the imperfect. Question 2 is true or false. The imperfect tense is used for regular or repeated actions in the past. How is that statement? Is it true or is it false? Give yourself a few seconds to think through it. Okay, now it's time for the answer. This one is definitely true. It can also be used for more background information, but usually it is for, just regular or repeated actions in the past. That's the main distinction. And number three, true or false again, all types of regular verbs have the same endings in the imperfect tense and the preterite tense. So AR, ER, and IR verbs, those are the different kinds of regular verbs. Do they all have the same endings, exactly the same sets of endings as each other in the imperfect tense and preterite tense? Give you a few more seconds to think through this. Okay, and let me show you the answer for this one. So this one is false. AR verbs have one set of endings in both the imperfect and preterite tenses. ER and IR verbs have a different set of endings in both the imperfect and also the preterite tense. So ER and IR verbs always have the same endings as each other in both of these tenses, which is crucially different to a different set of endings to AR verbs in each of these tenses. But it's not true to say that all types of regular verbs have the same endings, the same sets of endings as each other in the imperfect and the preterite. Okay, lastly, number four, how do you form the stem for all regular verbs in the imperfect and the preterite tense? Stem is potentially the easier part, part to form for all regular verbs in the imperfect and preterite tenses. Try and remember how exactly you have to do that. Okay, I'm going to show the answer to that now. So you just take the infinitive and you'd remove the infinitive ending, which is going to be either AR, ER, or IR, and that's all. That gives you the stem for all regular verbs in the imperfect and the preterite tenses. There will be irregulars as well in both tenses, particularly in the preterite tense, and do take your time when learning those. So, if you have any questions on any of this, or if you'd like more information about more personalized help, which I do provide as well, you can get in touch by email, Facebook, or Instagram. I post on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and even LinkedIn every day, sharing my love of languages with people, encouraging them to hopefully learn more and more languages and giving them methods to enable them to do so while having a lot of fun. And I post a lot about GCSE and iGCSE language exams too. Including Spanish GCSE and iGCSE. I offer advice on how to prepare, how to create a revision plan, go in feeling as confident as possible, and more. So well worth following me on each of those platforms. I do have many resources, including free ones, available for Spanish GCSE and iGCSE, and even for other languages too. I do one-to-one classes, group classes, courses, and plenty more. So don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to find out more about any of that.